Another year, another chance for Patrik Elias to be snubbed from the Hall of Fame class. I'm going to make a case as to why he should be elected into the Hall of Fame. And also, the New Jersey Devils have a new partnership with one of the owners of NASCAR. We have a lot to talk about in today's episode of Locked On Devils. Buckle up, everybody.
You're Locked On Devils, your daily podcast on the New Jersey Devils, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi, this is Bryce Salvador, and you're Locked On Devils with Trey Matthews.
Elias scores! Oh, Steven stepped up, nailed it. Brodor's got the puck. What a shot. The Devils win the Stanley Cup.
Alrighty now, what is up, New Jersey? Welcome back to the Locked On Devils podcast here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, college hockey play-by-play announcer, Devils writer for Pucks and Pitchforks, and also part-time credential media member, Trey Matthews. When this episode goes live at 3 p.m., the NHL will announce its Hall of Fame class for 2023. Now, I've been a part of the Locked On Podcast Network for nearly 3 years. I'm closing in on 700 episodes, but I can recall to one of the first episodes I ever did, and I talked about Patrik Elias and his case of being elected into the Hall of Fame, and I also compared him to a certain player that was elected into the Hall of Fame that same year, and I said, given how their stats are eerily similar, maybe Patrik Elias should stop being snubbed and be elected into the Hall of Fame already because he's one of the greatest Devils players in franchise history. So we're going to revisit that topic. In the first segment, I'll talk about Patrik Elias and what he was able to accomplish alone in a Devils sweater. Then in segment 2, I'm going to compare him once again to that said player, since now that I have a bigger audience and maybe a lot of you can agree with me in that regard. I think some people might already know which player I'm alluding to because just a big hint, this player was a part of the 2020 Hall of Fame class. And then to round it all off, in the third and final segment, we're going to switch subjects and we're going to talk about the New Jersey Devils and their involvement with NASCAR, particularly with Joe Gibbs Racing. Okay, to start off with Patrik Elias, I decided to split it up into 3 different parts for segment 1. So we're going to talk about his stats, we're going to talk about the system in which he played in, and then we're going to talk about some of his other teammates who are already in the Hall of Fame. So let's start off with his stats, because his stats is something that a lot of people point out and say, maybe Elias belongs in the Hall of Good, but not the Hall of Fame. Because when you look at some of his career stats, yes, it doesn't really stick out amongst the entire NHL history because he appeared in 1,240 games. He had 408 goals. He had 617 assists for a grand total of 1,025 points. But here's the thing. I always talk about on this show that you can manipulate the stats just a little bit. So like I just said, when you compare Patrik Elias' career stats to other NHL greats, Hall of Famers, current players, whatever the case might be, yes, it's not a clear indicator that it should be of Hall of Fame status. But here's the thing. Elias owns 12 Devils records. So in that case, look at all the other players that have played in NHL history. How many players can say that they have broken 12 team records or franchise records, whatever the case might be? That's a very small list. So when looking at Elias' stats overall, I want people to focus on what he was able to do for the Devils organization because, quite honestly, I think that speaks more volume comparing his stats to other Devils greats and also other Devils players than comparing him to other NHL players, because the name of the game for Elias is that some things didn't go his way, and we'll talk about that momentarily. But when looking at some of the records that Elias has broken, he holds the record for career points, career goals, career assists. He is the Devils' all-time leader in playoff goals, assists, and points. He owns the Devils' record for most points in a playoff season, record for career game-winning goals, record for career overtime goals, overtime points, record for career hat tricks, record for career shots on goal, record for career power play goals, and courtesy of my friends over at Pucks and Pitchforks, he also holds the franchise record for most points in the series when he scored 11 points against the New York Rangers in the 2006 Stanley Cup playoffs. So once again, I know a lot of people are going to point at Elias' stats and say they are of Hall of Good status and not really Hall of Fame. But similar to what I've said on this show before, yes, Elias's numbers compared to the rest of the NHL pack, the rest of the NHL history, I will admit it's not really up to par. But when you look at him amongst the Devils franchise, for the time being, he is the greatest Devils forward of all time. And this leads into my next talking point when you look at the system in which he was playing in, because let's look at some of the retired numbers for the Devils organization, shall we? First, Ken Danico, Scott Stevens, Patrik Elias himself, Scott Niedermayer, and Martin Brodeur. How does Elias stick out compared to the other players that I listed? Danico, Stevens, and Niedermayer are all defensemen, and Brodeur is obviously a goalie, which means that Elias, for the time being, is the only Devils forward to have his number hung at the Prudential Center. So this goes back to like the late 90s, early 2000s, because when people think of the Devils organization now, they obviously think of an offensive-minded unit because we talk a lot about Jack Hughes, Nico Hischier, Jesper Bratt. But if we turn back the clock 25 or so years ago, what was everyone raving about for the Devils? They were raving about their defense. They were raving about that trap defense, even though I talked to Bruce Driver, who was a part of the first Stanley Cup championship for the Devils organization, and he said the word trap wasn't in their vocabulary. But digressing a little bit, that Devils team was notoriously known for their defense. So plopping Patrik Elias into that defensive-minded team, it really held them back in a sense because he's not able to showcase his true skill set because he's not playing for the right system. But I think it speaks more volume to the fact that he was able to make the most of what he was being given and able to make a successful career out of it. Because one of the things I've been saying on this show, remember my episode yesterday when I talked about Yegor Sharangovich, I talked about the fact that you need to be adaptable and you need to work with what you're being given. And I think that's what Elias was able to do when he was a member of the Devils organization for God knows how many years. Because despite the Devils being a defensive-minded unit, a defensive-minded team, a team that was notoriously known for that trap defense or whatever anyone wants to call it, Patrik Elias was able to be given the tools that he was given, and he was able to utilize it to his strengths. And the fact that his numbers are still very respectable and very good for that kind of narrative that I'm throwing out there, I think that showcased what Patrik Elias is as a player. And now going on to some of his teammates, Martin Brodeur, greatest goalie in Devils history. Scott Stevens, greatest defenseman in Devils history. They're already elected into the Hall of Fame. So my thing is, like, when you think of the Devils organization, when you think of their history, obviously you think of Martin Brodeur. Obviously you think of Scott Stevens. And you also have to think of Patrik Elias because Brodeur, best goalie. Stevens, best defenseman. Best forward for the time being, Patrik Elias. So it doesn't make sense that Brodeur and Stevens are already in the Hall of Fame and Elias is not there with them, because that's sort of the big three for the Devils franchise when you think of notable players that have come and gone within their organization. So that's what I want the NHL to take into consideration, which is when you look at those two other players that I listed, you also have to include Elias and how he was a big factor in which the Devils were able to win 2 more Stanley Cups when he joined the organization. So that's how I think of Patrik Elias as a whole. That's what I think of him as a player, which is the stats. Yes, they're not amazing. They don't really compare all that well to some other greats that have played in the NHL. But when you look at him specifically for the Devils franchise, he owns 12 records. And I don't think a lot of players can say they own 12 records for any franchise they've been a part of. He was able to thrive in a defensive-minded system. So if he was to go to another team and they were offensive-centric, maybe we could see Elias's numbers inflate a little bit more. And then when looking at the big three, which is himself, Brodeur, and Stevens, why are Brodeur and Stevens already in the Hall of Fame and Elias is not there with them? Don't come at me. I know why. I'm just making a point, which is you can't think of Devils hockey and not think of Patrik Elias. So we're going to transition momentarily, and we're going to compare him to another player that's been on my mind for a few years as to why he's in the Hall of Fame, but Elias is not. But before we continue, I want to tell you guys about eBay Motors. So for a championship team, it's all about making sure that every player is the perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So next time you need parts and accessories, Head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure that every part you need fits just right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know which part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win with the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Okay, so let's compare Patrik Elias to another player who's already in the Hall of Fame, because I figured if I want to make a case as to why Elias belongs in the Hall of Fame, I need to compare him to someone who's already there. Now, when you think of this player, they put up similar stats, they have won similar accolades, they've won multiple Stanley Cups, and yet their numbers are not all that impressive when comparing it to other NHL greats. And this player was a part of the 2020 Hall of Fame class. Who am I referring to? I am referring to former Atlanta Thrasher and also Chicago Blackhawk, Marian Hossa. Because when looking at Marian Hossa and his overall stats, yes, they are better than Patrik Elias, but they're kind of similar, because just to give you a refresher, Elias has appeared in 1,240 games. He has 408 goals, 617 assists, 1,025 points. And then for Marian Hossa, he's appeared in 1,309 games, 525 goals, 609 assists, and 1,134 points. So the stats are very similar. And I was just wondering, because I wanted to get some other people's perspectives. So here's a fun fact for you guys. I'm actually in a group chat with other Devils content creators, which include Devil State of Mind podcast, Jersey Joe, the Brat Pack, Pucks and Pitchforks, Let's Go Devil podcast. And I asked all of them, I was like, why is Marian Hossa in the Hall of Fame compared to Patrik Elias? And they gave some good examples as to why that might be the case. Someone like Jersey Joe said, it's probably because of the big market, because Chicago is obviously an original six team. They're big on their sports because in Chicago, not only do you got the Chicago Blackhawks, once again, original six team, multiple Stanley Cups to their franchise, but you also have the legendary Chicago Bulls that was once led by Michael Jordan. You got the Chicago Cubs, the lovable losers, and of course, the Bears. So Chicago is a big sports market. When you compare that to New Jersey, their only professional team is obviously the Devils. And despite the New York Jets and the New York Giants playing in New Jersey, specifically the Meadowlands at MetLife Stadium, they do not claim New Jersey. They claim New York. So that's definitely an X factor right there. And I think a lot of people need to give more appreciation to the small market teams. But another example that some of my fellow Devils content creators gave was the Cups and the situation, because Marian Hossa has 3 Stanley Cups to his resume compared to Patrik Elias's 2. Now, the thing is like, I get that Hossa has 1 more Stanley Cup, but it's not like Elias has 0. And I think a lot of people will say, well, Elias wasn't a part of the first Stanley Cup given to the New Jersey Devils before he joined the league. And you need to take into consideration that Hossa was a part of 3 Stanley Cup championships of the Chicago Blackhawks organization within a 5-year span. And as you guys recall, it had been a good while since the Chicago Blackhawks had won a Stanley Cup prior to 2010. So I think that's something you can take into consideration. But Marian Hossa, in terms of his Stanley Cup regime, it's great and all. And I'm not going to deny that, because the Chicago Blackhawks organization has pointed out saying that they don't win those 3 Stanley Cups if Hossa was not on their roster. But if you guys recall, Hossa kind of pulled a Kevin Durant before Kevin Durant pulled a Kevin Durant. So in the sports world, we all know, if you're a big basketball fan, we know what happened with Kevin Durant. He was so desperate to win a championship. He already went to a 73 Golden State Warriors team. But Marian Hossa did the same thing years ago, because he was a part of the 2008 Pittsburgh Penguins team that went to the Stanley Cup final. They lost to the Detroit Red Wings. And then the very next season, Hossa signed with the Detroit Red Wings. They went back to the Stanley Cup final. Ironically, they're playing against the Pittsburgh Penguins. And that year, the Penguins won the Stanley Cup final. So Marian Hossa was definitely chasing that Stanley Cup a little bit. So I think if you want to say that Patrik Elias not being a part of the first Stanley Cup in Devils history kind of hurt him in that sort of aspect, then I would say Hossa just chasing constantly that Stanley Cup and just once again betraying his own team to get there in the first place. I think that hurts him a little bit. But am I stretching it a little bit? Probably. But I'm just saying that in terms of the Stanley Cup numbers, Elias has 2, Hossa has 3. I don't think that plays that big of a factor. But something else you need to take into consideration, and someone pointed this out in our group chat, was Patrik Elias the best player on the Devils at one point? Because when you look at someone like Hossa, was he the best player on the Chicago Blackhawks championship roster? No, but at the same time, when you go back to his early days on the Atlanta Thrashers, he was obviously the go-to guy. He was the man. He was able to get 100 points during the 2006-2007 season. And as we all know, Elias, he was always close to the 100-point threshold, but he never quite got there. And it's one of the things we've been talking about for Jack Hughes in this current generation. Will he become the first Devils player to reach 100 points? But digressing a little bit, that is an interesting talking point because I think the NHL also takes that into consideration, which is for someone like Elias, when he's paired alongside someone like Martin Brodeur or Scott Stevens, obviously you don't think of Elias as the best player on the Devils roster. You certainly think of him as one of the best, but is he the best? Is he the go-to guy? Was he that player that was driving the Devils engine? And obviously, when we talk about Martin Brodeur, a lot of people, myself included, will say that Brodeur was the greatest goalie to ever play the game. And obviously, that's a little unfair for Elias because that's hard for him to surpass. And then for Scott Stevens, he pretty much changed the game in terms of today's rules and regulation because let's face it, Stevens played the game with an iron fist. You came into his blue paint, get ready to get your head knocked off because that's how aggressive Stevens was. And he basically shape-shifted the NHL. And and one of the reasons why the NHL has a lot of these current rules and why you essentially can't touch a player without going to the penalty box, I would say Stevens was a pioneer in that. He broke the rules before the rules became official. So that's one way to get away with it. If you want to bend the law, break it before it actually becomes a law. Please don't take that advice. I'm only joking. But you get what I'm saying, which is Stevens and Brodeur are sort of trailblazers in the hockey world. And Elias, unfortunately, he falls short of that. Now, the thing I will say for Elias, and it goes back to what I said in segment 1, let's change up that narrative a little bit because, like I said, the Devils were a defensive-minded team. And Elias was the best offensive player on those championship runs. And when looking at Hossa, obviously he's gone from team to team to team, and he went from being the best player on the team to being more of a role player or an X factor type of player. And he was more of a leader with the Chicago Blackhawks organization. Now, I get it. He was still a very good player. Whereas for Patrik Elias, he stuck with the Devils organization through thick and thin and thin and thinner because he made his debut with the Devils organization during the 1995-1996 season, and he played all the way through the 2015-2016 NHL season. Now, I get there's a big what if for Hossa because he did have to hang up the skates early due to a skin disorder he developed, and I definitely have some empathy for him in that regard. But for Elias, here's his what if. What if he went to a different team? What if he went to a different organization? What if he went to a team that was very offensive centric, very offensive driven, a team that can utilize his skill set a little bit more? And like I said in segment 1, would we see his stats inflated a little bit? And something else that one of the Devils content creators brought up in our group chat was that maybe you have to think about that A line that Elias was a part of because some of his famous line mates were Peter Sikora and Jason Arnott. Now, one of the things that you have to take into consideration was that Elias was passing the puck to Arnott a lot. Now, if it was flipped a little bit, do you think Elias would have a better case in terms of making the Hall of Fame? That was a question that was brought up in our group chat. But my thing is simply this, because I think it benefits Elias either way, because the fact that he was passing it to Arnott and he was being unselfish, he was being a good playmaker, I think that really says something about Elias's skill set and also his character. Or if the roles were flipped, if Arnott was passing the puck to Elias a lot more, it would have just highlighted his goal scoring capabilities. So I think either way, that A-line, it still did a lot of good for Elias. And I get the circumstance, which is maybe Elias passed the puck a little too much and Arnott kind of stole the spotlight in that regard. But even if it was flipped, I think it still would have been more or less the same, because either Elias is going to be highlighted as a playmaker, a passer, an unselfish type of player, which he was, or he's going to be highlighted as a capable goal scorer. So here's my overall thoughts on Patrik Elias and the possibility of him making the Hall of Fame. Will he be a part of the 2023 Hall of Fame class? I really don't know. I'm not psychic. I'm not a fortune teller. I really want to say yes, but given what's happened the last few years, I really don't know. I'm not all that confident, but his time is coming, I feel as though. It just has to come at the right possible moment. And maybe it is this year, but we'll see. I think he's been snubbed one too many times. But I want the committee to consider this. Whoever selects the players that will be chosen for this year's class and beyond. Think of Elias and his overall impact on the Devils roster alone. Think of the records he was able to break and still hold to this very day as a part of the Devils roster, before Jack Hughes, before Taylor Hall, before Zach Parise, before all those players came after him. He was the offensive weapon for two of those Stanley Cup Devils teams, just to take that into consideration. And also, he was able to thrive in a system that really didn't benefit him all that much, which is why he is the only forward in Devils history up to this point to have his number retired at the Prudential Center. And also think of someone like Marian Hossa that we have to compare him to, which is the stats are similar. And when looking at the accolades, they're also very similar, because we talked about the Stanley Cups. That's obviously a big factor. But when looking at what else Hossa has been able to accomplish, he has appeared in 5 All-Star games. He was NHL second All-Star team in 2009, and he was NHL All-Rookie team in 1999. Well, Elias's accolades are more or less the same, because when looking at what he was able to do, obviously 2 Stanley Cups, 2000, 2003. He has appeared in 4 NHL All-Star games, and he was NHL first All-Star team in 2001. He won the NHL Plus Minus Award in 2001, and he was NHL All-Rookie team in 1998. So that's my thing. If Marian Hossa is in the Hall of Fame, there's no reason why Patrik Elias should not be there as well, especially since he's a trailblazer in the Devils organization, and he was able to accomplish a lot in a system that didn't benefit him, and yet he was still able to break records and hold them to this very day. And that is why Elias should be in the Hall of Fame. Okay, so to close out today's show, let's talk about NASCAR and its involvement with the New Jersey Devils organization. So for any of you out there, I am a big NASCAR fan, and Joe Gibbs revealed that they're going to be in partnership with HBSE. So I'm very familiar with Joe Gibbs Racing. I'm very familiar with their driver lineup for this season. Obviously, Ty Gibbs, Denny Hamlin, Christopher Bell, and Martin Truex Jr. Growing up, I was a big Tony Stewart guy. I know the legendary Bobby Labonte, and I know he left before the start of the season, but Kyle Busch, I know what he was able to accomplish with JGR. Courtesy of the Devils PR team, they recently revealed Joe Gibbs and their partnership with HBSE. So they said, today, Joe Gibbs Racing announced it has received significant investment from Harris Blitzer Sports Entertainment, HBSE, and Arctos Partners. The minority investment aims to support Coach Gibbs' vision for the growth of JGR as a family company and his continued leader in NASCAR. Through the investment, Joe Gibbs will become a limited partner in HBSE, pending approval of the NBA and the NHL. As we all know, Joe Gibbs is a legendary NFL coach. He's in the Hall of Fame. He was known for coaching the Washington Redskins, as they were called at the time. And this statement was released by Joe Gibbs. He said, quote, Josh Harris, David Blitzer, and their entire team have a vision that has delivered winning franchises in basketball, hockey, soccer, and youth sports. Their teams are among the most successful in their league in growing audience and sponsorship, and their commitment to the communities they work in are unparalleled. I am excited to join the HBSC family and have their support in growing Joe Gibbs Racing. HBSE also released a statement courtesy of Josh Harris, and they said, in recent years, I've been fortunate enough to get to know Coach Gibbs and proud to count him as a trusted friend and advisor. Joe is a winner, first in football and then with Joe Gibbs Racing. He has led organizations that build winning cultures based on strong values and deep commitment to family and faith. This investment and partnership aims to support his vision and allow Joe Gibbs Racing to continue its track record of excellence long into the future. So there you go. Joe Gibbs Racing has partnered with HBSE, the company that owns both the New Jersey Devils and also the Philadelphia 76ers franchise. And as a NASCAR fan, I just felt like that was actually a cool announcement. I'm glad that Joe Gibbs is now a partner with HBSE. Could we possibly see either the 76ers or the Devils on a NASCAR stock car? I don't know. I would love to see that. I think it would be really cool, but I'm jumping ahead of myself in that regard. But I don't know how much of you actually care about the news, but me as a NASCAR fan, I thought it was really cool, and I just wanted to share it with you guys. And I thought it was a good way to close out today's episode. So there you go. Partnership between HBSE and NASCAR. And I don't know what the future holds for both respective organizations, but we'll see what they're able to do in their future partnership. So that's all I got for today's episode. Leave a comment down below. Do you think Patrik Elias should be in the Hall of Fame? And if not, what is your reasoning? And also, if you're a NASCAR fan, comment your favorite driver and also what you think of the partnership between JGR and HBSE. As for today's episode, continue to stay safe. Have a wonderful day, New Jersey. Go Devils. I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Follow me on my personal Twitter page at TreyMatt4 or the show's Twitter page at Locked On Devils. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thanks for listening once again.